We acknowledge the original owners of the land on which we podcast, whose stories were told for thousands of years. Today, we are recording in Meanjin. We pay our respects to elders past and present who may be listening. Sovereignty was never ceded. A quick note before we get started that there may be some swearing in today's podcast. If you don't like swearing or usually listen with children in the car, you have been warned. You're listening to What in the NDIS Now, a podcast where I, Hannah Redford, and my friend Sam Rosenbaum interview participants and providers about all things NDIS. Hi Sam, how are you going?
I'm going well, Hannah. Yourself?
I'm really good. Who is our guest today?
We have Susanna. Susie. Welcome on, Susie.
Hi.
How you going?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We're very excited to have you on board today.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to be here. It's my first ever podcast appearance, so it's very exciting.
Yep.
Hopefully it'll be an easy one for you.
Yeah, nice.
No hard questions. We won't put on the hard word on you. Maybe that last question that we like.
Yeah, thanks.
So our first question, as always, is where did you grow up?
Wow, that's exciting. I am Kiwi, so don't hold that against me. I grew up... There's a lot of us here. I grew up in a really small town in New Zealand, so population like 5,000, and I lived in the country outside the country town. So a little lifestyle block. I've got 3 older brothers, and my mum now lives in Australia with me. A brother is in London, and I've got 2 brothers in New Zealand. One in New Zealand and one here in Australia too. Small town, small high school. Didn't move around a lot. Stayed in the same house my whole life from when I was born right through to when I left school at 18. And so that was where I grew up.
Amazing. I mean, all these Kiwis coming over to Australia and taking our jobs. How dare you?
Hey, at least we're good at some of them.
Yes. I'm joking, of course. So how did you get into the disability sector?
Well, I never intended to fall into disability work. I actually wanted to be, first of all, I wanted to be the pastor of a church. And then I wanted to be a social worker. So when I left school, I went from the small town in New Zealand, it's Dargaville, right at the top of the North Island, down to Dunedin, right at the bottom of the South Island, where it's very cold and lots of snow. And I went to Bible college for a year. And then I cross-credited into a Bachelor of Arts where I studied Community and Family Services, which is social work, and Religious Studies. I needed to do that to cross-credit it in. And then when I left university, I didn't want to be a social worker. I felt like I didn't have enough life experience to nail that as in my young 20s. So I went and worked in retail for a short period of time. And then decided that I didn't want to sell frivolous crap for a living. So I went into disability support work. So I was a disability support worker in New Zealand for about a year before moving into more of a coordination role with a company over there, and then moved over here. And I've always worked in disability since. So it landed in my lap. And I loved it, and I will never do anything else. I absolutely love it. I think sometimes you fall into things for a reason, and they just kind of click, I did worry at first whether I would be any good at working in disability. I hadn't really had any exposure to disability before. Being sort of small town, regional New Zealand, it wasn't something that I was exposed to a lot. I had no idea what I was doing at all. I remember rocking up for my first buddy shift and thinking, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm going to hurt someone and this is not going to end very well. and I went home that night and I called my mum, of all people, and said, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't think I can do this. And she said, well, it's not for everybody, but somebody has to do it. And it might as well be somebody who's going to give a genuine shit about it. And so I went, right, well, that's pretty much my motto. If I can do good, I should. And so I will.
I love that advice from your mum there. That's a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
little piece there.
It is. And it's funny, I think the reason why disability has really anchored itself so much for me is that lack of exposure prior to that experience. I see the value that people with a disability bring to community. And I think I benefit from that exposure and gaining that understanding. And I see, like we were talking a little bit earlier, Hannah, about, that ignorance within in community, and it's not a maliciousness and a not wanting to understand. It's literally they just don't know. They find themselves in situations with people that they don't understand and just don't think about it. So that's my disability experience. Funnily enough, and it's nearly 20 years of working in disability, I've seen so many changes. So, and I'm sure that you guys have as well, going from the old block funding with the register of need and everyone sitting on the RON and, and how dysfunctional that was, to, even the proposal of NDIS back in the day, when they were just whispers, in the corridors of what it could be, and then the rollout of it and seeing what it's becoming and evolving into. So it's a pretty fascinating space to be working in.
It is indeed an ever-changing landscape.
Isn't it just?
Yeah.
And then, they throw in those reviews constantly.
Yes.
Necessary.
Lots of reviews. So
Yeah.
hopefully we might actually get some implementations of the recommendation over the next 5 rather than just more reviews.
I hope so, but I am hopeful. I think the outcome of the recommendations of the latest review are really good. And since I've moved into the SDA space, I probably should mention I went from getting the look, went from the direct support space. So I worked for quite a large not-for-profit organisation in Australia for nearly 10 years at a senior management level. So I managed Queensland and Northern New South Wales and managed the NDIS rollout for that organisation. I ended up eventually transitioning into the SDA space. So I was getting the direct support space is great, and my heart is still with that. But the organisation I was working with did a restructure, which I wasn't necessarily aligned with. I felt that there was some risk involved in what they were proposing, so I moved on to work with Lauren Avani, who you've already done a podcast with. And so I learnt all about the SDA space. So now I actually work for an SDA provider. After a short stint at trying consulting for myself, and I've realised I'm not very good at running my own business. I'm not real good at monetising my time.
It does take a bit, especially when it's like the hourly and support coordinators listening will very much understand that pain.
Yeah, and it's funny because the reason I did it was twofold. One, I needed employment that was flexible around my family. I've got 2 young girls. But also, too, I could see this gap between SDA provision and support provision and a real lack of understanding in how the two work well together and how necessary it is for them to work together well. So I thought, well, I've had enough experience now within the direct support space in SDA to try and bring these conversations together. And that didn't really, it was happening, it just wasn't really monetised, unfortunately. If I could do it for free, I would. So that's when I came on board with Disability Housing Solutions. So really similar role. It's, it's really bringing together that NDIS service provision knowledge and the importance of, understanding that well and why we do what we do with that housing provision and the SDA. So bringing the two together.
Yeah, it's quite a balancing act there, because even in the consulting world, which is my space as well, we're either fully disability housing consulting and that's all they do, or we're kind of supports in the broader spectrum, but you don't see a lot of overcross and the tying together. So I really like that idea.
Yeah, and look, it is so important because if you don't get the SDA right to support the support model, it's never going to work. For example, with the pricing review for SDA, shared house SDA funding is not, it's fairly comparable to an apartment single occupancy now. That doesn't mean that someone who is funded for shared housing can safely live in a single occupancy apartment. So will an OOA be suitable? Can they identify risk? Can they call for help? Or do they actually need that line of site support in a dwelling? So, for an SDA provider who doesn't understand the impacts of support in the dwelling could quite happily say, yeah, no worries. Oh, your feasibility fits, the owner will accept you and they move in, and massive risk, is in place. So it is so important. And thankfully, I think both the SDA support providers and the direct support providers are realising that they need to work hand in hand to be able to make this work well.
There was a lot of providers entering the SDA market straight off the bat when they sort of did, and they went with really kind of robust, heavy stock. So we've got a lot of like fully accessible stock, but not a lot of housing options that necessarily suit psychosocial disabilities and some of those more sensory-based.
Absolutely. And I think, the design standards when it comes to that robust and the sensory environmental needs to be readdressed. It's a whole separate issue. But I think when you're looking at when NDIS first rolled out and SDA was the concept for housing, you got to remember you had a whole lot of support providers who had what we'd call legacy stock. So they'd got these grants, they built these houses, and then they were like, yay, we can enrol them as SDA and get additional income. They did that, registered as an SDA provider along with every other registration on the list because they could, and then realised it actually wasn't something they were good at.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There was unfortunately quite a bit of that, and I think there still is a bit going on.
Oh, yeah, and I think, there's a lot of spruikers out there, unfortunately, building it very... I just say it's not fit for purpose. They're building SDAs that are not fit for purpose. Is the nicest way to say it. And there's, that's sad for the owners that have purchased them as an investment. We see that quite a lot. The owners come to us and say, help, we've bought this property. We've been told that we can get 5 robust tenants in a house. And we say that's never going to happen. And that's awful that, that you've been led down the garden path. But let's see what we can do to make this work within the sector. Let's see who we can help. And that's where we look at creative ways of, whether it's child safety sort of transition plans or corrections, or, there's lots of other ways that we can look at utilising those properties because, they're there, and they do have some benefits to the way that they've been built. It's just not for the purpose that they were built for. So just working within the sector to get creative and making sure the needs are still met. Yeah.
It blows my mind constantly that you would spend $1 million or so building an SDA house and it not be fit for purpose, because it's sometimes I'm like, didn't you ask just ask one other person their opinion, one other person. It confuses me that you're going to spend so much money for really nothing.
I think that the tragedy is, you're right, it is confusing, and they didn't ask anybody, what they were building and whether it was going to actually meet the need of people with a disability. But it's not the people who own it now that have done that. There are big developers out there who've gone out and just, they buy 400 square metres in a Stockland estate and build a 3-person robust house. Then they on-sell it, so they sell it on to a mum and dad investor, and they promise them the earth because they go, here's the price guide, 3 people with robust funding, that's going to cover your mortgage if you buy this for $1 million. And mum and dad investors go, yay, I'm going to do something really good for community, I'm buying an SDA house, this is a really good investment, and then they find, oh, hang on.
Trying to feel that is a completely different scenario.
Well, the likelihood of 3 people with robust needs living in a house together is slim to none. But they haven't done their research. So the onus is shared, I think, on that. But I live in hope that we'll see less and less of that. Yeah.
Yeah, due diligence is very important.
It absolutely is. And it's about where people are getting the demand data from as well. We know that the agency puts out data that's not necessarily, I was going to say fabricated, but that's probably not a good word to use in public, that is flawed. And it's about talking to people who are actually on the ground, who understand what the need is, going out and talking to people with a disability, talking to support coordinators, let's actually find out what the need is and genuinely fill it instead of just building stuff and hoping that people will mould to fit it.
Yeah, that mentality definitely needs to be a thing of the past and stay there too.
It absolutely does. Yeah, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing with the NDIS all over, isn't it? We've gone from block funding and people are trying to, replicate that to a certain extent. And make people fit into that old model within a scheme, and it's not working. And I think as the NDIS evolves, we're seeing that break down. People are starting to realise that you can't just create a mould and expect people to come and fit into it. We need to actually tailor our supports and tailor the way we run our services to the needs of the people that we're serving.
Yeah, individualised supports.
Exactly, person-centred supports. And it's funny because we giggle about cliches, but they're so important. Like if you go down to the meaning of it, individualised support and person-centred support that's basics, isn't it?
Yeah.
How are we still talking about that after deinstitutionalisation?
Oh my goodness. It boggles the mind.
It
really.
does.
It definitely reminds me of the disability employment places that we've got that were set up under block funding and then have just continued on and pay people peanuts, which equally makes me furious because how dare you? They're people, they're still human beings, and that they're given this really menial, meaningless work as if they can't, and it's not individualized. They don't look at, well, could this person in front of me who's been doing this same job for 20 years potentially do something different? Could we capacity build them to do something different rather than, put 5 bags of chips in this box along the conveyor belt? Like, really?
I totally agree. And I feel your fury. Actually, that's probably one of the parts of, NDIS or disability that I've never been involved in, is the whole, supported employment, well, not necessarily supported employment, but the enterprise side of things. Because in the back of my head, I'm going, well, aren't you, by saying we've done an assessment and we're going to pay you this percentage of, minimum wage, are you saying that I'm that percentage of a human? It's so dehumanising. So I would love to see in the future that that's wiped off the face of the earth. It's capacity building, isn't it? Like that's what we should be living for, capacity building.
Lately there is movement happening to phase that employment scheme out, which is very much welcome.
Yeah.
And the sooner the better.
Absolutely. And hopefully it will, transition to something that is more positive for people. It's not, and I think we often go, that needs to stop, but we don't think about what the solution is and the alternative. It's not just saying we're canning this and you guys don't have a job anymore. It's we're canning this because we see that you would give so much value to this, or we've got something better. So.
Or that you are really good at working on an assembly line, so let's pay you the minimum wage of an actual human being.
Well, I tell you what, head down to the Port of Brisbane and there are people working in warehouses on assembly lines. They're not getting paid the percentage of a minimum wage.
Not at all.
So human rights right there.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about what is the specific role of the SDA or Specialist Disability Accommodation provider that is very separate to the support that goes in the house?
Absolutely, and it is so important that they are so separate. So, look, at the very crux of it, the SDA provider is like your Ray White of the disability world. So they're your property manager, but they're working under the Residential Tenancies Act, but they're also working under the NDIS practice code. So they walk this balance of we need to make sure that we're looking after the property, rent is paid, so they take the SDA income and the reasonable rent contribution, they distribute that back to the owner. But they're also responsible for making sure that the tenant in that property, that their environmental needs are met. So it's about, there's a lot of risk identification and management. So, as people's needs change over their tenancy, it's being able to identify that or work with their support providers to identify that and either manage those risks within the environment or work out a plan to move to an SDA that's better suited. Often when we look at SDA funding and there's someone who has fully accessible funding, but we know that within, 3 to 5 years, they're going to be needing a ceiling hoist. There might be some, inevitable assistive tech improvements that they're going to need. So there's negotiations that can take place through the SDA provider with an owner around, this, you might be taking a lesser income right now, but you've got a long-term sustainable tenant in your property, so you're not going to wear those vacancy rates. So you're managing their safety now, but also into the future. So the SDA provider is sort of that intermediary between the owner and the tenant, but also responsible for making sure that that tenant's safe. The big one for me is making sure that an SDA provider doesn't have any handshakes or allegiances to the SIL provider operating out of that house. That's where it becomes a little bit danger, Will Robinson. I've come across multiple situations where, a tenant decides they don't like the SIL provider, and because the SIL provider has an affiliation with the SDA provider, or God forbid holds a head lease on a property, they have to move out. So that's a situation that, I hope, will stop. I don't ever want to see somebody have to move out of the home that they love and meets their needs because they don't like their support workers. I feel like that's fairly basic.
Yeah, it has almost that monopoly feel in some of these instances where you do have that, and like we're not meant to be working with bonuses or commission or incentives.
Yeah. Well, look, I think it's laziness on some SDA providers' behalf as well. They don't want to wear the onus of tenanting a property, so they'll give the head lease to a SIL provider and put the onus on them. Yeah, okay, like that makes their job easier, but it's not safe. It's not safe for tenants.
So tell me a little bit about, for the people listening, the difference between having a head lease and the lease with the participant.
Sure. So a head lease is, some SDA providers will hold a head lease on a property. They have to have a head lease essentially to manage it, or a management agreement over it. The tenant will usually have a rooming agreement. So the SDA provider is responsible for that property and making sure that rent is collected and paid. So in that essence, they've got a head lease. The rooming agreement is with the SDA tenant, and they've got all the rights under the Residential Tenancy Act. Just like you guys would renting a property, so does the SDA tenant, has that rooming agreement. Any SDA tenant should have a general tenancy agreement or a rooming agreement if it's a shared occupancy.
And it's not just even for SDA, it's like any accommodation
100%.
because it's a practice standard. And it's mind-boggling where in the last couple of months, I've been sort of helping out in certain situations that have risen and there's no lease involved. Full stop. And it's a GST requirement for it to be a GST exempt thing, but that it's a legal requirement in so many instances. And then you see a lot of providers also coming back and having a bitch about not getting paid, and there's nothing they can. That's kind of like your main thing, well, besides the GST and a few other things, and protecting the participant. But it baffles me the amount of providers that don't understand the importance of having a signed in-place service agreement, and it's a tenancy agreement in this instance.
Absolutely. Look, and an SDA tenant should have a lease or a tenancy agreement and an SDA agreement, because the SDA provider is responsible under the Residential Tenancies Act and the NDIS. So they cover the two separately, although they work together. It protects everyone by having a lease or a tenancy agreement involved.
Well, most people wouldn't go into a house without having a copy of the lease to know to tell the landlord that they're not allowed to come do an inspection if they're rocking up every second day.
Absolutely. And you know what? The SDA provider should be talking the tenants through that residential tenancy agreement and the SDA agreement, so they understand what their rights and responsibilities are under both. And there's
because there are
much
a lot
confusion.
more requirements under the residential tenancy agreement, and it varies from state to state as well. So
Absolutely.
it's not an easy document to understand that, especially when you're throwing it in with a SDA agreement, and then on the side, you've also got the provider agreement. So then the participant's getting even more confused for the supports.
That's exactly right. And, the stakeholders working together to make sure that everybody understands those agreements is so important, and it's honestly taking the time with a tenant to talk through it with their stakeholders and being able to have that open conversation of, if you're confused about something, just ask. Like, we're here to help you understand it. That's actually our role as an NDIS provider, is capacity building. You know, we want to help you to understand what your rights and responsibilities are. We want you to understand what our rights and responsibilities are to you as well, so that we can work together, you know, collaboratively and make sure that you get the best out of this tenancy.
I'm pretty sure that, like, as you're sort of saying it, the more that the SDA provider does to engage, work with the participant, the better that relationship's going to be, the longer the participant's going to stay in the property, the longer that you're not on the market and losing your investment sort of strategy plan there.
Absolutely, and that's where we talk about, you know, vacancy rates. So that's not good for an owner, but also too, as an SDA provider, our goal is long-term, safe, sustainable tenancies. No one likes moving. It's risky, it's expensive, it's not in a tenant's best interest, you know. So the idea is to get the right tenant in the right house, build a good relationship and have them there for as long as they want to be, you know, not forced out, not moving because they're not safe, not moving because of, you know, relationship breakdowns or changes in supports or anything like that. Their home is their home. It should be safe, it should be secure, regardless of what else is happening in their life.
Yeah, so who do you think it should be responsible for tenancy matching?
That's a good question. Look, I think it should fall back on the SDA provider. Not a lot of SDA providers do it or do it well. It's a service that we've brought on board with Disability Housing Solutions. We know our properties really well, which is good, and thankfully we've got really good established relationships within the sector. So, you know, being able to find tenants is not an issue for us. I think I feel terrible saying a lot of SDA providers, but some SDA providers out there basically, you know, they throw it up on a website and hope that tenants will come, and then owners are left with vacancies for long periods of time, you know, end up with, you know, the wrong tenants and the wrong properties for whatever reason. There is a responsibility to make sure that they're vetting the tenants, and that's what tenancy matching is. Yeah. So look, I think it should be done by the SDA provider, but it isn't necessarily. And you know, I think if you want it to be done well, as the owner of an SDA property, it's a service that you need to pay for, quite frankly. Yeah.
So when you're an SDA provider and you're looking at, you've already got someone in the house, and then you're looking at filling your next vacant room, what would the requirement, or how much do you get that original tenant to participate in this, or do we not have that?
In the tenancy matching.
Yeah.
So the tenant would obviously be involved in the application process. So they're choosing the house that they want, or, you know, from a group of houses, they would view it as well. So they'd be going through walkthroughs, the OT would be going through. It's essentially the tenant's choice as to where they want to live. So they're really actively involved in that process.
What about the original tenant? And if you've got a 2-bedroom, you already got one filled.
Oh, sorry, in the shared arrangements. Yeah, absolutely. So they would meet. So the first tenant, so the incoming tenant would obviously check it for suitability. So you'd be looking at OTs and is it even suitable to consider? Once that's been determined, you look at the compatibility of the co-tenants. So, you know, how are they getting it on, likes, dislikes, lots of questions around, are you a day person, a night person, do you like pets, what music, or, you know, all of those sort of nuts and bolts. But at the end of the day, they need to meet. So it's around meet and greets, and then if they're happy to proceed, then you'd look at a transition plan. So at any stage during that, either party could pull pin. Yeah.
And I think one of the things that people get wrong with tenancy matching is going, oh, they have the same disability, so they'll get along swimmingly. And I'm like, no. Sometimes they need to have very different disabilities so that it gels better. And then you can look at the likes and dislikes and music and stuff like that. But when you look at a house with even 3 bedrooms and you go, oh, everyone has autism.
Therefore, they will get along.
No, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works.
It's not. Look, and I think people need to take that diagnosis out of the mix. It's about them as a person and who they want to live with. And I think the beauty of Appendix H is that now they don't all have to be SDA funded either. So it sort of opens up that pool for shared living where people want to and are able to share. There's more people for them to choose from. So we're looking at one person might be SDA funded and the other one might be at ILO or SIL or whatever. Drop-in supports, doesn't matter, we'll make it work. It's finding that co-tenant that they want to live with and that the support needs are compatible in some way.
So we're speaking about shared accommodation. In the Disability Royal Commission, there was a big focus on eliminating group homes and stopping the forcing of sharing. And there's lots of advocates out there discussing this topic because it's very stark contrast to the NDIS review as well, which is kind of more supportive of developing mechanisms to kind of expand the sharing and the support mechanisms. What are your feeling on the two variances there, and do you think that it could be viable for SDA providers to be able to only do sole occupancy?
Look, I think there's always going to be a place for some form of shared living. Some people do want to share, and we see that. We get people asking, for people that they can share with, flatmates. Group homes, horrendous. Let's not even talk about that. They're taking it off the table for a reason. And I think, look, my personal opinion, if I was to pull out my magic 8-ball, is when the review that's come out talks about shared living, I actually don't think that they're looking at it from a SIL perspective. I think that there's greater plans to push people into things like ILO arrangements. I don't think that they've articulated it very well, and I think there's grey areas in the way that they've articulated this recommendation in the review. But I find it very, very hard to believe that anybody would make the recommendation to push people into shared living or into SIL arrangements. I think the option needs to be there because there is a want and a need for it. And it's not viable to just have single occupancy dwellings. Although SDA providers are becoming, or developers are becoming very good at designing properties that are single occupancy in one dwelling, if you know what I mean, like duplexes.
Kind of more units and...
Yeah, and they're getting creative with the floor plans,
There are some really smart, savvy designers and architects out there. I've seen some plans for some things that are actually truly incredible.
Yeah, and that's what we need to see more of, that creativity and ingenuity and how can we take the confines of what we got and make it work in a practical sense. The gaps there are obviously talking to people about what does actually work and able to employ that. But I don't think that the agency's intention is to push people into shared living. I don't think that's going to be what the future holds. I hold great hope, but I think group homes absolutely will never return, and so they shouldn't. And I think when we talk about that shared ratio that's come out of the review recommendations, I don't think it's a conventional SIL.
Yeah. The disability accommodation space is kind of one that requires a lot of understanding and a lot more intense levels than just your standard compliance. So generally speaking on it from a consulting point of view, I won't actually consult on the SDA space because it then requires a little bit more understanding of housing, tenancy, regulations and that sort of
stuff. It's a complicated beast. Yeah,
absolutely.
It really is.
So I really like that sort of point where you're calling out that it's what the review says and what it smells like might not actually be the same thing.
And I think we see that out of the agency a lot.
Yes.
And it's funny, after working in disability for so long within, the structures of what was block funding or, that state-based funding and now the NDIS, sometimes you can smell it. Like you hear everything that's coming out of it, you read the little tidbits, and then you can read between the lines, where you go, okay, well, they haven't said this. And now I know that's why, because this is what their plan is. So they're deliberately avoiding a specific topic or a certain avenue. So, you sort of get spidey senses up. You know?
It's like when they drop a media release at Friday at 4 p.m.
Because why not, right? Give us all something to think about on the weekend.
Or sometimes it feels like they just have like thought bubbles and they come out and say them and you're like, what? We couldn't possibly implement that. And I think they're the times where you have that sort of smell and you go, looking beyond this, the minute that they see no one can actually implement this, they'll get rid of it. And they do.
They test the waters for sure.
They test things and then they quickly turn around. And that's why the rules change so much. And you just go, what am I doing now? Hang on.
Do you know, I think the thing that fascinates me is that the interpretation of the rules changes so much. It kills me. It's like a full-time job, just trying to keep up with it.
Oh, it is a full-time job.
Yeah, it's crazy. Even, you know, just thinking about all the changes within the SDA sector over the last couple of years, you know, with pricing changes and trying to anticipate what they're doing, and like looking at the price changes to do with, you know, how they changed house to bring it in line with an apartment, but then they bumped down the villa, and I'm sitting there going, okay, so they're looking at unmet need and demand, and they know that they've effed up and there's a gap, so they're going to bring these in line to fill the gap. So you're constantly working the Rubik's Cube to try and figure out what they're doing, and then going, so once they've done that, they'll change that.
I like that analogy of a Rubik's Cube. I'm going to take that one.
Yeah, and that's what they're constantly doing. I don't think that the colours will ever align. But we can see which way they're turning it.
There was a child that came along and moved the stickers around.
Yeah, that was probably me.
So I wanted to ask you a bit more about conflicts of interest within the SDA space. There have been some times where I've seen the owner of the house then becomes the SDA provider and then gets a SIL provider in to provide. So talk to me a little bit about like the issues with that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, look, I don't think that's necessarily a conflict of interest in the sense of an owner being an SDA provider. I think that can work quite well. Where you've got an owner who becomes the SDA provider and enters into a collaboration agreement with a SIL provider without having a tenant that's chosen that SIL provider, I think that's ignorance. I think you've got, you know, an investor there who doesn't understand their role as an SDA provider. They've probably paid someone to do everything for audit, and don't really understand what their role is under the NDIS. I think, in my experience, owner SDA providers works really well when they are also like the tenant. So that works really well, especially, you know, it's that autonomy, capacity building, all that kind of stuff. Most owners who become an SDA provider, it'll be to claim back their tax credits, and then they'll actually hand over the SDA provision to someone else. They realise that it's a much bigger job than what they anticipated, and that will inevitably cause those unethical or those collaboration agreements with a conflict of interest, they'll fall apart. So yeah, it sorts itself out in the long run.
It does kind of like have the feel of coercive control when the SDA provider is pushing someone into a SIL provider and going, that's kind of your only option.
Yeah, look, I had a really, not a bad experience, but I was very, very cross. It was about 18 months ago, came across a property where we were asked a tenancy match, and the owner sort of had a, you know, backhanded handshake agreement with a SIL provider. And so we was asked to tenancy match this, but everyone who applies has to use the SIL provider. And I went, absolutely fucking not. I'm not tenancy matching that property, and had my little tantrum in the back because I don't want to be aligned with that kind of a conflict of interest.
Rightfully so, because then you would be breaching the requirements of the Act at the same time.
Absolutely. You know, and I think, you know, I do this work because I genuinely give a shit. You know, and I don't want to, as part of my job, do something that goes against my ethics and my morals, you know.
So that brings me to SDA providers who are also SIL providers, all in one, which is a big no-no, like we know, but a lot of people out there don't understand why that's such a big no-no and why it's such a huge problem. So
it is a problem. I don't think it will even be allowed in the near future. I think what came out of the Royal Commission and out of review, that'll nip that in the bud fairly quickly. There are very few providers that are the SDA provider and the SIL provider who are doing it ethically. I do know of some of the larger organisations who obviously, you know, had a lot of, you know, legacy stock or block funded properties pre-NDIS that have enrolled them as SDA and still hold the SDA providership, but their organisation is so large, there's a massive degree of separation between the actual support provision and the SDA provision, and those tenants have been given autonomy. They can choose their provider. So if they turned around and said, we don't want to use you as our sole provider, the SDA side of the business would quite ethically turn around and say, we won't force you. So there are very few of those companies that have that conflict of interest managed well. Most don't, and I think it's a very dangerous path to go down. So I think the agency will prevent that from being able to happen in the future, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out right now. Where there is an SDA provider who is a sole provider, danger, red flag.
For participants or family members out there of participants moving into an SDA, what would be some of those, how would you go, or what would your advice be to negotiate if they're trying to force that? Is it a walk-away situation, or can we sort of get people onto the table to make that work a little bit better?
Oh, it's so difficult. Look, I would encourage people to, just walk away. If it's your still provider who is also your SDA provider and they're asking you to sign a lease with the SDA provider who is the still provider, it's messy. That they are taking away all of your choice and control. And while you think it might work out because they might have the best of intentions, look, it becomes really complicated and it makes people uncomfortable. And I would say try your best to negotiate, but otherwise just don't even enter into it.
I think that's some good advice.
Yeah, it's just messy. It's really messy.
And can raise some really big concerns and also make it hard for that participant or family to raise a complaint and for it to actually be investigated.
That's right, because all of a sudden the security of their tenure is at risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a nice position to be in. And we look at, Maslow's hierarchy of need. We need our home to be safe and stable, for everything else to build on that. And if you're not feeling comfortable, with who your the actual housing provider is of where you live, there's problems there.
Before we finish, because I'm mindful of time, I do want to quickly touch on, we did quickly say about the owner occupied person with a disability all in one. So a participant could, if they had the money, build an SDA property that suits them, is in a place they like, and then they can be the SDA provider, and then they find their own supports. Because it doesn't have to be SIL. It can be drop-in. It can be
anything.
Anything. The SDA is only the bricks and mortar.
That's correct. Yeah.
So the building. Does the NDIS, I'll ask this question, does the NDIS encourage a person to do that?
I think like anything with the NDIS, it's not encouraged nor discouraged. It's just not mentioned. I think it's definitely not discouraged at all. I think it's a fantastic option where someone has the ability to do that. Absolutely do it. Like, why wouldn't we want to own your own home? None of us want to be paying off someone else's mortgage for the rest of our lives. And if they have the opportunity to own your own home that is going to meet your needs, go for gold. It's just I think the most difficult part is around the banks and the finance of it. So even though your SDA income is counted as an income for servicing your mortgage, you still have to have your deposits, and it's subject to the same lending criteria as anybody else. So it's making sure that you have all those ducks in a row.
Awesome. So, in your ideal world, what would the future of the NDIS look like?
Hannah, I thought about this. Not too long, because
and hard.
ADHD.
44 minutes to go over it.
Yeah. Look, my first thought that comes to mind is I feel really uncomfortable answering that question because I don't think it's about me. I think what my vision is of what I think the NDIS should be is completely irrelevant. I don't live with a disability. I don't utilise the scheme. I just work underneath it. So that aside, from a provider perspective, I think transparency is key. I think the actual nuts and bolts and the mechanisms of the scheme are not going to be perfect. Nothing is perfect. We're on a long road to working it out. But I think transparency while that's occurring is really important. This magic 8-balling and Rubik's cubing and guessing, and that's not fun for anyone. And it's not effective or efficient. So instead of guessing what the latest KPI is within this game, let's actually be transparent around, what is actually happening, and integrity. I think if everyone's operating with the best of intentions for the right reasons and is open and honest about it, then the scheme will go well. Like I said before, I think the review is actually really good. I think the review that came out is very considered. I tip my hat to Bruce Bonner-Hattie. I think the vision is there. I know what's happened now is a mess, what we're working in, but it's a newborn baby. So we're working with what we've got, and I think, the intention is for it to get better, and we can't ask for too much more than that, so long as there's transparency and integrity in the way that operates. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's
been a great chat.
I reckon I could just sit here for the next couple of days.
Usually the commentary at the end of the end of the.
We've probably got 1,000 more questions we could throw at you, but not all the time in the world. We definitely would be excited to have you back.
Oh, thanks.
But yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. Huzzah!
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please share with people you know. Until next time, as the Green Brothers say, don't forget to be awesome.